Ever feel like you're standing at the bottom of Mount Everest, but instead of proper gear, you've got flip-flops? That's what having a huge EE goal can feel like, am I right?
Totally. It's daunting, overwhelming, and can make you want to just stay put.
Exactly. But what if I told you there's a way to make those Everest-sized goals feel more like, say, a walk in the park?
Sign me up.
Well, that's what we're diving into today. We've got these excerpts from this motivational paper, and it's all about breaking down those massive goals into totally manageable steps.
And it's interesting because it's not just about practical tips or whatever. This paper actually digs into the psychological reasons why this approach works.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We're not talking about some magical overnight success thing, right?
No magic, just consistent action and a little bit of mindset shift, really.
Okay, I like the sound of that already. But what's the psychology behind it?
Well, you see, our brains aren't wired for these huge, undefined tasks. We're wired for immediate rewards. Think about it.
We get so easily overwhelmed,
Hmm.
which is totally normal, by the way.
It is. But the cool thing is, we can hack the system.
Hack the system. I like it. Tell me more.
It's all about breaking down those big goals into smaller achievements. Because every time you hit one of those milestones, boom, dopamine hit. Suddenly, you're not just working towards this distant thing, you're racking up wins along the way, almost like a...
Like a video game, but for real life.
Exactly.
Love that analogy. And speaking of analogies, the paper uses a great one about building a business. That always seems so daunting, right?
Right.
But then you break it down. Market research, finding suppliers, building a website, and suddenly becomes this step-by-step process instead of this big scary thing.
You're not staring down the whole mountain anymore. You're just figuring out base camp, what gear to pack, which route to take.
That does make it feel way less intimidating. Okay, I'm with you on all of that, but how do we actually put this into practice? It's easy to say, just break it down, but what does that really look like, in real life?
Well, that's where this paper gets really practical, because it gives us a clear roadmap with 3 key steps.
3 steps. Okay, lay it on me.
So we've got clarity, deconstruction, and action.
Okay, I like where this is going. Clarity, deconstruction, action. Let's break those down a bit further, shall we? What do we mean by clarity?
So clarity is all about identifying your ultimate goal. We're talking laser focus here. What's that mountain peak you're aiming for, right? You've got to write it down, visualize it, make it real.
Gotcha. No wandering around in the foothills, getting lost along the way. We need a destination, a clear target to aim for.
Yeah.
Then what?
Then comes deconstruction. Think back to that business building example we were talking about earlier. You take that big, daunting goal and you break it down into smaller milestones. It's like, what are all the little things, the little wins we need to rack up in order to reach that summit?
So it's like creating a project plan, but for your dreams.
Yeah, exactly.
And suddenly, instead of this big, overwhelming thing, you've got these manageable steps. Okay, so we're clear on the goal. We've broken it down into milestones.
Yes.
What's the final piece? We've got clarity, deconstruction, and trust.
Action.
All right, action.
This is where the rubber meets the road. You've got to turn those milestones into daily or weekly actions. Like if we're sticking with the mountain climbing metaphor, this is your climbing schedule, your gear checklist, your daily training regimen.
It's all about building those habits,
Yeah.
right? Because our brains, they love routine.
They do.
So if we can kind of I don't know, almost trick our brains into connecting our goal to something we already do consistently, it's like we're sneaking in a workout without even realizing it.
Precisely. And with each small step, each day you stick to that schedule, you're not just making progress towards the goal, but you're training your brain to see that goal as totally achievable. You're building that confidence muscle one step at a time. But there's one more crucial element we need to talk about if you really want to make those goals a reality.
Okay, so we're clear on our goals. We've broken them down into bite-sized pieces. We're taking action. But, sometimes it's like you get so bogged down in the day-to-day, you kind of forget to look back and see how far you've come.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get tunnel vision when you're laser focused on the next step, the next milestone.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole idea of celebrating small wins comes in.
Yes. Celebrating those small wins. It seems so simple, but it's huge.
Yeah.
And kind of counterintuitive, right? We think, okay, I'll celebrate when I hit the big D goal, but celebrating the small stuff along the way, that's what keeps the momentum going.
100%. Remember that dopamine hit we were talking about earlier? It's not just about reaching those milestones, it's about acknowledging them, really savoring those wins. Every time you celebrate, whether it's hitting a savings target, finishing a week of work towards your business idea, Whatever it is, you're reinforcing that positive feedback loop.
Like you're literally rewiring your brain for success, one little win at a time.
Exactly.
And speaking of which, I love how the paper talks about keeping a journal, like specifically for your accomplishments, no matter how small. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just a place to jot down those wins.
It's such a simple strategy, but it's so powerful. Think of it as like your own highlight reel of success.
I love that. Your highlight reel.
Right. Not only does it boost your mood in the moment, but then later on, like on those days when you're feeling discouraged, you can look back and see, wow, look at all these things I've accomplished.
It's like that extra little boost of motivation when you need it most.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about breaking down goals, consistent action, celebrating the journey. And, another thing this paper mentions that I think is so valuable is this idea of learning from the greats, those people who've already achieved amazing things. And they specifically reference books like The Power of Now and The War of Art. It's like getting bonus reading recommendations from the experts.
I love those books. And while we obviously don't have time to do a deep dive on those today, the common thread connecting them to our discussion is this understanding that the journey itself, the process of working towards your goals, that's just as important as the destination.
Which brings us right back to where we started, breaking down those goals, celebrating the wins, focusing on consistency. It's all about embracing the process, not just fixating on that end result.
Because it's in those daily actions, those small wins, those moments of self-reflection that you really grow. That's where the magic happens. But, even when we break things down, it can still feel kind of overwhelming sometimes, right? So how do we simplify things even further?
That's such a good point. And I love how the paper offers some really practical tools for this. Like one thing they talk about is creating a flow chart.
I know, it sounds so basic, right?
It does.
But visually mapping out your steps, even for something complex like launching a business or tackling a big personal goal, it's amazing how much clarity it can bring.
It's like it takes all those jumbled thoughts swirling around in your head and puts them down on paper where you can actually see them.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, this is step one, this is step two, and then there's the 80-20 rule, which is always a good one to keep in mind.
Oh, the 80-20 rule. I'm a big fan of that one. So just as a refresher, that's the idea that 80% of our results come from 20% of our efforts, right?
Exactly. So the key is to identify what those high impact 20% activities are and really focus our energy there.
Because it's so easy to get caught up in the smaller, less impactful tasks, We think we're being productive, but we're not actually moving the needle.
Right, like going back to the business example, you could spend hours and hours perfecting your website copy. And don't get me wrong, that's important. But is it as impactful as actually getting your product or service in front of potential customers?
Probably not.
Right. So it's all about identifying and prioritizing those 20% actions that are really going to move the needle for you.
Love that. Okay, so to kind of wrap things up here, it seems like the key takeaway from all of this is to shift our focus away from the overwhelming pressure of the endo goal, that big, scary thing that's looming out there in the future, and instead focus on the more manageable and, dare I say, enjoyable process of taking those consistent small steps.
Perfectly said. It's about finding joy in the journey, celebrating those small wins, and trusting that even small actions, when done consistently over time, can create massive change in our lives. And that's not just about achieving specific goals, that's about living a more fulfilling life overall.
So true. It's not about the mountain we climb. It's about who we become along the way. And you know what? You might even find that the journey itself becomes so rewarding that reaching that summit, well, that's just the icing on the cake.